children weren't allowed out at all, ever, for anything. So like I literally didn't see a child for weeks except for my own. It was pretty crazy. You could only go out based on like the last number in your ID, like how that matched with the day of the week. There was a curfew, so at 3 o'clock a siren rang across the town, and then the police would patrol and you couldn't be out. And I mean, there's literally, like these 8-foot tall propane cylinders surrounding us, and our battery is like hissing and spraying chemicals. And the Colombian owner came over and invited us in for some coffee.
You're listening to the GHT Overland podcast.
Imagine this. You're on the overlanding trip of your dreams that you've planned for years. You're roughly 2.5 years into it, and then the country closes its borders, sets stringent curfews and rules. What do? Do you react? Do you book a flight home during the very small window available for 1,000 plus a seat? Life does present unending challenges with decision points. It's your turn to decide. What do you do? And how do you roll with the punches? I love this episode for so many reasons. First and foremost, this week's guest wrote a book about her Pan-American experience with her husband, John, and their daughter, Lily. To say the book is a good read is cutting it short. Mary's style of writing draws you into the trip as if you're right there alongside them, holding your breath as John is ripping hissing batteries from the van, frustrated alongside Mary as she explains border crossing tribulations, laughing as she describes preparing for border crossings, and in Lisa's case, crying within the first 2 chapters. Just look up Monkeys on the Road on Amazon. You can add Mary Holland Donner to the search, but just Monkeys on the Road will pull it up. It's a bestseller on Amazon, and it's very clear why. We will also have a link to Mary's book in the show notes if that's easier for you, because if you're driving right now, safety, no worries, it'll be in the show notes. As we continue our preparations for full-time living on the roads of adventure, hopefully with more dust than mud, because we're pretty tired of 40 degrees, overcast, and rain every day. It's been busy for us, from upgrading shocks for the truck so we hopefully don't rattle our teeth out on those washboard roads, to adding airbags to better support the weight of what will be our new home. And a big thank you to my sister for letting me have full use of their shop. Thank you, Kelly. Love you.
Oh, we will announce our new rig with all its awesomeness when we take delivery of the final key component, and we could not be more stoked. All we can say is nimble, comfortable, and reliable. Those were our key non-negotiables.
Yep. We're almost done with a steel-wrapped safe that replaces a rear seat. Pretty proud of that custom job. I did post a few pictures on Instagram. No, they will not stay there for very long. And then what else? So last week was a week of tribulations. Our laptop locked up with a black screen of death. Thankfully, Apple pulled some geniusness out of their pockets. And we're back in business, promising not to be complacent on backups. And I would encourage you, apples are awesome. Well, apples are really delicious, but Apple computers and products, I think, are pretty fantastic. Not free from locking up and causing you much grief. So do your backups, people. Do your backups.
Oh, our kitchen remodel is done. We only have a few quick counters in the bathrooms to do. some paint, and a few magic touches, and we're ready to sell this little gem.
I love how you say just a few quick counters. So, I think that gets you caught up with us, if you were interested. We have a little surprise waiting for you at the end of this episode. We think it was definitely worth the wait. Something we've never done before, and I can't think of ever hearing another podcast do something so unique and so special.
Are you going to tell them what it is?
I kind of hate to give it away.
I think you kind of have to.
Well, true. Or it won't make sense, right? Okay, so John, who is the husband of this week's guest, Mary, wrote and produced a song around Peru. Well, actually, he wrote a few songs. This one just happened to be inspired a couple of years into their Pan American trip around Peru. John was kind enough to allow us to include it at the end of this episode. And if you hear that weird sound in the background, that's Laria chewing on her little toy. But she has to be with us, so bless her heart. And to me, it's magical to hear a song specifically inspired by overland travel on the Pan American Highway. So all credits to the song at the end of this episode belong to John Stanfield. Nicely done, John.
Okay, so let's roll into our conversation with Mary Hollandoner of Monkeys on the Road.
So, Mary, you wrote a book on your overland experience driving the Pan American from California to Argentina starting in 2017, then being stuck in quarantine for a year in Argentina in 2021. I'm assuming you probably haven't had enough time to kind of let things settle in. I'm not sure. Given the circumstances today, would you do it all over again and leave tomorrow?
Yes, I definitely would. The good definitely outshone the bad on the trip. It ended up being almost 4 years. And I mean, even that 1 year that we were stuck in Argentina, and I shouldn't use the word stuck, but it gives it a negative connotation necessarily. But we were in communication, obviously, with lots of friends and family back in the US and even in England, my home country. And we kind of concluded after the initial kind of worry that the first month was a little bit scary. Everyone across the world was unsure if zombies were going to climb out of the graveyards or what was going to happen, right? But after the initial month of craziness and things seemed to be a bit more calm, it seemed like we were in just about as good of a place as we could be anywhere else. In fact, maybe a little bit more mellow to be in a small mountain town with access to hiking trails and rivers and climbing. And so, you know, to some extent, we felt better off than some people who were stuck in big cities, whether that be Buenos Aires or San Francisco or whatever. So in some ways we were kind of lucky that we were there, but it was definitely a bit scary too. And there were other bad things that happened on the trip, of course. It's impossible to be gone for that long and not have some bad things happen. But like I say, definitely more good than bad over the 4 years. And I would, not only would I do it again, but we are sort of planning that we will do it again at some point in the future.
That is awesome. And then before we get too far, for our listeners, seriously, this is an adventure book, heartwarming, eye-opening, a seriously good read. Our recommendation is to order Mary's book on Amazon before the end of today. Then, Mary, I got to tell you, Lisa was crying in some sort of woman revelation, excitement. I'm not sure what, within the first 2 chapters of your book. I just wanted to throw up a hammock and never put the book down. Seriously, this is a great book. What inspired this trip for you? What inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, well, I guess kind of 2 different questions, right? If it's what inspired the trip or what inspired the book. I guess if I do both, so what inspired the trip? I think I've always just been someone that really loves traveling and having different and new experiences. I was raised in England by American parents, and I think I've just never really fit in 100% anywhere. So, you know, whether it's my friends calling my house and being confused about my parents' strange accent, or the fact that I have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and no one knows what that strange smell is. Like, I've always just been the odd one out. And so I think traveling to new places or just having an affinity for other foreigners has always been part of my life. And I really love to see new places, and even more so than seeing the new places, meeting the new people. You probably saw in the book a lot of the things I dwell on as the experiences with other people that we've met. And then the book itself, I definitely didn't have a, I want to write a book in my life, or I'm going to do this trip so I can write a book. It really just started as, I want to tell my mom and friends that we're alive. And then that grew as the stories became interesting that we were experiencing. That grew into a blog with photos and stories. And then the incredible thing I'll never forget was when I started getting comments from complete strangers. And I have no idea to this day how they found this blog, because I was just like posting it on my Facebook page, But gradually I got more and more strangers commenting on the blog saying how my writing was great and the stories were great and I should really write a book. And it just kind of put that little nugget of thought in the back of my head, like, could I actually write a book? I don't think I could, but maybe I could. And so over the years of the trip, I started trying to write the blog posts in a better way that could actually be a chapter, rather than just like a, hey, we're doing well, here's what happened yesterday kind of thing. And then when COVID happened, and we were in this rental house in central Argentina for a year, homeschooling, but with lots of time, I was like, all right, I'm going to give it a try. I'll give myself a few months. I'm going to spend 3 hours every day. My husband signed up for taking our daughter 3 hours a day, and I sat in a room and just wrote and sort of convinced myself that I could do it.
That is awesome. And before we get too far into all the wonderfulness of the book, on the vehicle, the van that you guys drove, can you give us kind of a quick overview of that vehicle so we can kind of paint that picture of what you guys were driving, and maybe any name that you gave the vehicle?
Yeah, sure. So it's to the non-technical person, it's a big white van.
Awesome.
The lid goes up and down to give us more space. To the more technical person, it's a 20-year-old Ford E350. It was a sportsmobile top when we bought it, which is, so the lid goes up and down from the inside, and it's effectively like a tent, but it's not a rooftop tent. You're inside and you can stand up. But there wasn't enough space for 3 people to sleep. And so my husband actually drove it to Colorado and switched out the top for a Colorado camper van top. And that's pretty similar to the sportsmobile top, if you're familiar with that, but it extends over the front a little bit. So our daughter, who at 6 years old is obviously much shorter than we are, is able to sleep across the width of the van, where effectively over the front 2 seats, whereas my husband and I are sleeping lengthwise in the main part of the van. So anything else about the van specific? Oh, and the name you said. Yeah, when my husband showed up in the driveway with this, to me, massive monstrosity of a van, my daughter, who has always been studying a bit of Spanish since she was born, I've been trying to speak Spanish to her, she immediately named it Vancito, which, if you're not familiar with Spanish, Cito is like, technically it means, or if you actually translate it from a dictionary, Cito means little, so you could say anything, Cito means little. But it's also just kind of a term of endearment. People will put that on the end of your nickname or something. So it became Vancito.
That's awesome. And do you know how much fuel could you guys carry, and how far would that take you?
We have a main tank, which is, I think, something like 45 gallons of diesel. And then we did go to the lengths of setting up actually installing a second tank under there, because the little bit of research we did about the actual trip, we heard stories of people needing to bring extra tanks. And, in almost 4 years, like 3.5 years of the trip, we used it one time. So, for anyone planning a trip, there's no need. If you've got that big of a primary tank, there's really not a need for a secondary tank. And, if and when we were to do it again, we would use that space for like a storage container or something rather than the extra fuel. But yeah, when we did the Lagunas route in southern Bolivia, that probably some of you are familiar with, that's when we filled up that second tank, and we're glad we had it.
I think Bolivia is where we get some really good stories about people running out of gas in one way or another.
Yeah, that's probably true. It's probably that Lagunas route. And we had our own crazy story in Bolivia that's probably a pretty unique and definitely an unexpected story, because they broke into a political revolution and the whole country shut down while we were there. So unfortunately, it's a country that we didn't really see very much of, but the Lagunas route became our escape route out, because everyone said that that one border post wouldn't be closed because it's too remote, no one would bother to block it. So it became kind of an adventure in a different way.
That's super interesting. Wow. And then, so back on the van though, how much water could you guys carry and what would you do to filter water when you felt you needed to?
Yeah, so we have a 20-gallon tank, which I think isn't that much for 3 people. But the genius idea my husband had, which I thought was overkill when he was first setting this all up, was our sink has 2 faucets on it. One is a filter and one is just simply a pump from the tank. And we were so glad he had done that, because there were many times when we were camped somewhere and there was a river or a lake or something like that, and we could just get our salad bowl and scoop some water and put it into our tank, and we'd still be able to drink out of our tap. So that was if I was going to say like one specific tip for Overlanders, the 2 faucet system is great. You have an inline filter on the one of them.
Okay, and then on the refrigerator, what size of refrigerator did you use, and any recommendations to other people, whether it was the right size, too big, too small?
Yeah, gosh, I don't know what the size. It's the one that came in the van. It's like maybe knee high on me. So what's that, like 3 feet maybe tall? It's just a 12-volt fridge that plugs in to our basic electrical system. It was definitely small. I mean, each time we'd go and shop, it was cram-packed, and we had food in all of our clothes drawers. One of the great things about Latin America is that you don't refrigerate your eggs, so that really saved our space in the fridge, because those would always be in one of our clothing drawers. But yeah, the fridge, I think we had a tiny bit of a freezer. It's not actually a separate compartment, but just a sort of shelf on the top inside of the fridge, which has ice on it. And that would kind of hold something cold for maybe a few hours. Like if we bought something frozen in the morning, it would be defrosted by the end of the day. So it's one step up from some of these just kind of simple cooler style fridges, but definitely not as fancy as some of the things I've seen.
And for heating and cooling, did you guys have a heater built in or AC? What did you do in the more extreme climates to not get too unbearably hot or cold?
Yeah, I mean, so on the too hot front, which is basically the beginning of the trip, right? Because assuming if you're starting in the U.S., you're dealing with it being too hot for most of the first year or two, or depending on how long you're traveling. So for that, all we had was a fan in the roof, like I've seen in many people's rigs, the same fan. And when we put our lid up to sleep, all of the window, quote unquote, is just plastic, can unzip, and there's a mosquito mesh behind it. So when we were camped in Costa Rica or Ecuador in the jungle and it was really hot, we would have the fan going and all the windows zipped open as much as they could be. And really, any other moment of the day, we'd just be outside of the van. We really didn't spend that much time inside the van. We'd eat outside. We mostly homeschooled outside. So the heat wasn't too bad. There were definitely nights that it was pretty hot. So, you couldn't even put the sheet over you because it was so hot. And then on the other end of the spectrum, once we got down into the colder areas, we did have a heater sitting underneath Lily's seat, our daughter's seat. And I think it's Webasto, and it's just a diesel. It just pulls right out of our diesel tank and runs off that. And that worked incredibly well. I mean, we'd run that thing for 10 minutes and be in T-shirts inside of the van because the van is so small.
And what is one thing you find indispensable either on or in your vehicle? What can you not live without?
The faucet thing I already mentioned, that was really helpful and surprisingly so. Maybe the other thing that we had debated when we were first setting up the van was our cooking system. So most nice vans have the stove, really set in on the kitchen counter inside. And we really we thought we would want to be cooking outside a lot, which ended up being true. So we just bought a camp stove, and it just sits in a drawer, and you have to plug it in each time, which is a bit annoying. But the great thing about it is that 90% of the time we eat outside, we cook outside. So we have a table it's actually designed for the stove to sit right in. So as soon as we park anywhere, we pop the lid, we pull out the table, put the stove on it outside, and plug it in. And now we're standing out in the sand on the beach, or on the mountainside, in the field, whatever it might be, cooking outdoors. And we set up a separate smaller table and our 3 chairs next to it. And it's just a really nice way to spend so much more time outside than in. And then on the few nights when it was, raining or really, really cold or whatever it was, then we could set the stove up inside too. And it was a bit cramped, but it would work. So I think that's one thing that I hadn't thought about that much. And I'm really glad with the way we ended up going.
I'm probably overthinking it, but I was thinking yesterday we should probably get some kind of a folding table, because exactly all these places are so beautiful. I can see you would want to be outside doing as much of everything as you can, not inside a vehicle, right? Do you know what kind of table you guys used, Mary?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. You have to bring a folding table and 2 chairs, like number one. I didn't even think to mention that when you asked the question, because I was like, of course you have to bring that. Because really, think about all these places that you're going. The best part about being in the van, I think, is that you camp at the beautiful location. You don't just go there on a day tour and then go back to your hotel. There were so many times where we were camped somewhere like, one of these amazing cenotes in the Yucatan in Mexico, or some of these remote ruins in northern Peru. And there might be a lot of people there, but then around 4 or 5, everyone's gone. And you're not only like spending the whole evening there and getting to experience it, but it's your living room and it's your kitchen and it's your, your homeschooling table room. Like, so that was really my favorite thing, was that here I am brushing my teeth or eating my dinner or whatever, standing in amongst these incredible locations. I think that's really like one of the biggest bonuses and differences about traveling in a van. So yeah, I mean, the brand of a table, honestly, actually, we brought some table with us, and at some point it broke, and we bought a new table in some random store in Colombia. So it doesn't really matter as long as it stands upright and it can fold down.
And then, was there anything you never used or removed?
I can't really think of anything that we took, and I think maybe we almost were like on the opposite end of the spectrum of taking not enough. We were so anal about cutting down our stuff. I think we've done enough backpacking, and we're big rock climbers, the pair of us, and so we were pretty used to bringing the bare minimum. Like, we're going to share, one jacket and one headlamp and one power bar kind of thing. So when we packed for the van, we thought, okay, Lily, you get to bring 3 stuffed animals and 1 game. We were pretty strict about minimal stuff. If anything, I think we probably picked up things along the way and made space for them. Like, a cool thing that we picked up along the way that we never would have brought from the beginning, because we thought it was too much of a luxury, is an oven. So a friend of ours came to visit us in Nicaragua, and we had shipped to his house before he arrived this Coleman oven. And it's just it's basically like, imagine a metal box that folds down flat to nothing. And then you set up the box and you sit it on top of a burner on your stove. And I mean, it's not the best oven, but it works pretty well. So I started baking bread and baking like a quiche for breakfast. Like, it really opened up some possibilities when you're camped in a beautiful place. And we would be spending hours homeschooling every morning, so we could take some time to cook interesting things.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, my husband and I found it online. I was like, what? How can we possibly have an oven? I think we met some Overlander at some point, and, we always invite each other into their vehicles and give tours. And we had a few, often French people, that would have an actual oven in their van. And I was always like, wow, I can't believe they've used up all that space for an oven. And so John started Googling around and found this camp oven that takes up no space at all.
That's awesome. And what did you guys do for mail? That's one thing that we're currently struggling to figure out. Yeah. If you're going to be gone for so long, how do you do that?
You need a mother-in-law that lives in the USA. I know that's not necessarily the solution for everybody, but because my family's all in England, so that would have been kind of tricky to give it to them. But basically, any friend or any relative, any person you trust can become the person. So while John was doing all the setting up the van systems and whatnot, that was my job, was all the logistics and finances and whatnot. So I actually have this spreadsheet that I can send you. It's my to-do list. I made a kind of trimmed down, simplified, shareable version of it, because so many people have asked me these questions, and I've been sharing it with different folks, so I can send it to you guys if that's helpful.
Yeah, please.
But yeah, the first thing I did was I did a mail audit. So I think you said you're leaving in a few months. So if you start from tomorrow, literally every single piece of mail that comes through your mailbox, write it down and get yourself either off the list if it's just junk mail, or call up and switch to only electronic delivery, and do that with every single piece of mail over the next few months. And then think about things that are less common than that. Like, once a year, maybe you get, a property tax bill or something, and try to get those all switched to e-delivery. And then, even though I was sure I had got every single thing switched, and I told John's mom, don't worry, you're not going to get anything. But she was like, the address that I switched, you have to have some mailing address, of course, in all your banks and whatever. So I put everything on her address, and she still was always getting mail for us. So she would just take a photo and WhatsApp us a photo of it.
Perfect. That's good advice. Thank you. So navigation, communication, did you guys do, if you were in charge of logistics, how would you plan your route each day, making sure you didn't get lost?
So, making sure we didn't get lost, So we really didn't plan our route. Like basically, we said it kind of jokingly, but it was true. Like we're just going south.
Awesome.
So, we left Yosemite and we were aiming for Argentina, and I think this is probably very common among people once they actually get on the road. But when you're doing a trip that's that long, like you don't plan it out. You can't possibly plan that far every day. If you do go take a 1 week holiday to whatever country, you probably plan out what you're going to do because it's so short. But when you have a trip this long, you just wake up and you go. I mean, sometimes we'd wake up and we'd do our homeschooling and then we'd have lunch and then a family would come by and Lily would start playing with their kids and then they'd invite us to dinner and, I guess we didn't leave today. We stayed here 2 nights after. Or on other days, she'd get through her school much more quickly than we thought. And we'd start driving, and then we'd sort of always have a general idea for where we were heading, basically south, or maybe a specific location. We heard that so-and-so was a really cool place to visit. We'll head that way. But we'd really just see how the day went. If we were tired of driving, then we'd stop for lunch, and if the lunch spot was really beautiful, we'd stay there. It was really kind of driven by how we felt each day.
Okay. And then for like cell phone service, what did you find worked best for you? Were you picking up SIM cards or...
Yeah. So, I'm not just saying this because I worked at Google for 10 years, but Google Fi is like the most amazing thing.
That's awesome.
It was brilliant. I mean, so we, you get a Google, the one thing is you have to do it before you leave the USA. There were so many people we met that tried to switch and they couldn't do it because they were out of the country. But, so you get a Google Fi SIM card, just like you would for Verizon or AT&T or anything like that. And you put it in your phone. And then every time you cross a border, it just flips. It just works. The downside is that it's more expensive because of the simplicity of it, and it provides you with unlimited data everywhere, and so then you tend to use that data, and then you get charged a lot more. Other people we met would do a new SIM card in each country, which was just a bit trickier, of course, because when you first cross a border, you're typically in the middle of nowhere, and it takes a while to find somewhere to go get a new SIM card, and then the system is different everywhere, and it's a bit trickier. So another thing that was really helpful is whenever we got to Wi-Fi, we would download our Google Maps or Maps.me or iOverland or whatever thing we were using. We'd download that area so that then when we were navigating, we weren't using data. We could be offline navigating. So that was really helpful.
Okay, cool. Did you guys use a InReach or a Spot for any emergency communication?
Did we use one? No. Did we bring one? Yes.
Very good.
It's a tough question. Like I think partly because of having, a 6-year-old along with us, we thought, okay, let's get one of these things just in case, because you just imagine the possible terrible things that could happen. And if you've got this magic button that you press and, helicopters appear from the sky to rescue you, I mean, I have no idea if that would actually happen. But so, yeah, we had one. We never used it a single time. In fact, I can mail you it if you want to bring it.
Awesome.
So your book is packed with stories. Your time in Costa Rica really captured us. And if you had to pick only a couple places, what are 1 or 2 places that you'd consider your favorite?
Yeah, I think if I think about moments and events and that stood out that I'll never forget, they're probably driven more by the people than the places. Like definitely there were places that were beautiful, like northern Peru. These remote high elevation hikes that we went on were just gorgeous. And the wild beach camping in Costa Rica was gorgeous. But I think the most memorable things were some of the interactions and connections we made with local people. Like this time in Mexico that you probably have read already about, when we were going to camp on a lake and a family approached us and said, we think it might be dangerous for you to camp here because we just had the Dia de Muertos, festival, event, holiday. And so there could be drunk people coming through here in the middle of the night. Come and stay with us. And so we went and stayed with them, and we had this beautiful day together the following day where they were cooking for us, and we were just learning a lot about their livelihood and the earthquake that they had just survived and their house was falling down. I mean, those are the kinds of things I think that stand out in my memory more. Another one would be in Guatemala when we crossed over from Belize, and I was really hoping to find some way to start volunteering in some way at that point. We'd been on the trip for a few months, and we came across this Canadian woman that had started an organization there in this little town, El Remate. And she had a library where she let people come in and get English lessons. So we started volunteering, teaching English. And we met this family who I'll just never forget. It was this girl at the same age as Lily, Dulce, and they became great friends. And we started taking her to school every day. She lived with her grandmother, and that was it. And the grandmother sold tortillas for a living. Like that was it. Literally, she made tortillas in the morning, and whatever she made from them in the afternoon, that's what they lived on. And they had us to their house so many times, and I feel like I learned so much from this one grandmother telling me about living through the bad times of Guatemala and just how grateful she is for her safe life that she leads in this kind of ramshackle hut on the side of a road, So, yeah, I feel like there was so many times where I met really interesting local people, and I feel like those would be my biggest learning moments of the trip.
So from exploding batteries to puke to squirrel monkey muggings, South America sounded a little tough. What would you say the most challenging situation was that you guys experienced?
Yeah, it's funny. Like when I was writing the book, I thought, the way that you should write a book is you start with some exciting, captivating hook, and then there's like this whole like trend. But when you're writing a true story, you have to write it how it happened. And the fact is that South America was full of crazy stuff. Central America was lovely and delightful and, beaches and swimming and monkeys. And South America, all kinds of crazy shit happened. But yeah, I don't know if I had to pick a single thing. It'd be hard to say. I think maybe like in Bolivia, which I alluded to earlier, that was pretty intense. We were in the southern part of Peru around Lake Titicaca, and one of the things that I did religiously was follow the local news for whichever country we were in and whichever country we were soon to enter. And so I was following the Bolivian news, and I knew that there was an election going on. And it looked like, I think it was the day before we were going to cross, the preliminary results were coming in from the election. And it looked like the way they do their elections there is you can't win on the first round, unless you get over some very high percentage of votes. But if no one gets more than X percent of the votes in the first round, then they do a second runoff. And so it looked like there was no way anyone was going to get enough. So we drove over the border near Lake Titicaca. And then we didn't have reception for a couple of days. And when we next got reception pulling into La Paz, the capital, we found out that the president at the time, Evo Morales, had declared that he'd won, and he had stopped reporting the vote counts, and it was all just, a bit suspicious, and people started revolting and protesting in the streets. And we basically got into an Overlander spot, this wonderful family, Marcos, Las Lomas. If you go to La Paz, you got to stay at Las Lomas. We luckily got into there just before things kind of exploded, and then we were just holed up there for weeks with him. The whole city was pretty much shut down. You couldn't drive anywhere. There were protests in the street, and we just were watching the news like a hawk, talking to him, talking to every shop owner within a couple blocks, buying as much food as we could buy, filling up our water tanks, water tank. He was telling us, we'd watch on the news and we'd hear that the other side was threatening to cut off the water supply to La Paz. And I'd be like, oh my God, can they actually do that? And he'd say, well, yeah, they did that once before. I'm like, oh my God. Okay, I'm going to go and buy like 100 bottles of water, Or we watched a speech in a square on TV there, and the opposition leader was saying, let's shut down the borders and make sure no one can come or go. Let's shut down the entire country. And John and I kind of look at each other like, oh my God, like if we shut down the borders, what do we do? So that was kind of an intense situation. We felt somewhat safe because we just, by a stroke of luck, were with this wonderful family who were local Bolivian people and could help us understand the situation better than we ever could on our own. But yeah, it was still a little strange, something that you don't normally live through living in the USA.
That would be a little unnerving. I think we could all do with a lot less politics.
Yeah, exactly.
Jeez.
Yeah, it was also interesting just to see how the local people kind of just took it in stride, like, yeah, here we go again. Like, this is just what happens down here.
That's crazy. So on laundry and hygiene, what did you guys find worked well for you? How did you manage those things?
Yeah, well, so laundry, there's a sort of like the every day or every other day where you can like wash a bit of your laundry in a sink or something like that. But it was pretty easy everywhere we went to find a service, an actual lavanderia, like a laundromat. Or sometimes, depending on where you were staying, there'd be a woman who you could just pay to do your laundry. So that was pretty easy. We did our own if we were away from anyone that could do it for us for a long time. But there were tons of opportunities for someone to help. The hardest thing was like just trying to find somewhere to dry it too. When we were, like camped on the beach, for example, then we could wash our clothes and hang it and we'd have lots of space. But sometimes it's harder to find a big area for that.
Your kitchen setup, can you give us kind of a detail on how you set that up for cooking each day and what worked or what you might change?
Yeah. So, well, I think I said a bit before about how we had the stove that isn't like permanently set into the kitchen counter, and we really like that. So we have a fold-up table that we set just outside of the van and set the stove on top of that, and that plugs into our propane under the van. And then we have a second folding table that we put next to that, or just anywhere we want near that outside, with 3 fold-up chairs. And that was basically our kitchen. And then inside is the sink. So, and the fridge, of course, is inside too. So usually for dinner, one of us would be inside passing things out, and one of us would be outside cooking at the stove. And then we basically, all 3 of us, be outside for the evening or the morning.
And a favorite recipe?
A favorite recipe? What would a favorite recipe be? Well, like I said, we really liked once we got the oven and we were able to start baking things, that was really fun. For dinner, I think we did a lot of just like the rice and veggies that everyone seems to cook. And then at some point, I can't remember where we got the idea, we found an Indian butter chicken recipe, and that became kind of our favorite standby one-pot recipe that I'd have to look up and send you. But it was tricky to go and find all the different kinds of spices, but there was always some market that would have all kinds of mysterious powders that you can get.
Mysterious powders, oh dear.
And you could try to figure out which one was which.
That's great. So, Mary, on border crossings, at the end of chapter 16, you talk about mind-numbing, exploding bureaucracy, which really sounds pretty intimidating. Can you give us a few examples or walk us through that day going from El Salvador to Nicaragua?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that one, all of Central America, I'm not sure why, it's just really annoying to try to get through the borders there. I don't know if it's because you have to just cross them so much more frequently, or if they actually are worse than in South America. But yeah, so the one I think that I write about in the book that was kind of comical looking back on it, is going from, was it into, I think it was from El Salvador into Nicaragua? I can't remember now. No, El Salvador to Honduras to Nicaragua. Anyway, whatever it was. But yeah, I think it was entering Nicaragua. So yeah, we parked in the sort of parking area, which is never clear when you enter one of these border crossings where you're supposed to park, or which building is the spot that is going to like stamp your papers, or because sometimes it's like literally a guy under an umbrella, and sometimes it's a big concrete building with many doors, and you don't really know what to expect depending on the country. So we parked in a big area, and there was a market in full swing, lots of stands, people selling all kinds of food and trinkets and everything like that. And then we found the building that we think we were supposed to go into, but of course, but to get to it, we had to walk through basically like a dancing show. There was like a whole bunch of people in matching colorful costumes swirling and dancing around, and a DJ playing really loud music as they were dancing to whatever the song was. So it was very different than every other border crossing we had done before, and a bit confusing. But we kind of worked our way through, feeling like we were imposters on the stage almost, and went into the building behind them. But then once we were inside, you have no idea where you're supposed to go. It's just chaos. There's like different people behind desks everywhere and doors, and you have no idea which one is going to be the thing that you're supposed to be doing, because most people are not foreigners with a vehicle. It's like these land border crossings are set up for local people, mostly from one of the two countries where the border is, to go back and forth. And you're a very rare case when you're crossing these borders with a vehicle as a foreigner. So usually the passport stamping is fairly straightforward, because that's obviously the most common thing to happen at a border. But the vehicle importation and exportation is always really complicated. So yeah, that was an especially tricky one. No one really had an idea what we were supposed to do, and rather than be unhelpful and say they didn't know, they would kind of make things up and point us here and point us there. And finally, someone said we should go outside and find, I think it was like a man in a blue shirt or something very mysterious like that.
Yes. I'm like, seriously? I bet everybody has a blue shirt today.
Yeah, exactly. So we went back outside, again through this dancing parade of people. And I'm tapping on shoulders of men in blue shirts. Do you know how I import my vehicle? And they'd be like, what? Why are you asking me that? What? And so I think I went back inside again and found someone and demanded them to help me actually figure out what I was supposed to do. And they found the right man in the blue shirt. And it was all about inspecting the vehicle, which was comical in and of itself, because once I found the right person, they would say, where's your vehicle? And I'd kind of point through the throngs of people, and they'd say, oh yeah, I think I see a white something that might be a van. Okay. And they'd sign your paper. and then say, okay, now I'll go find a police officer and he's going to do another inspection. And so you're off again on your scavenger hunt, wandering around through this parade and market and dancing troops, like trying to find a police officer. And the police officer is like, doesn't want to help you because it says he's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so then you show him this piece of paper with like a handwritten scribble on it and say, I think you're supposed to sign this thing. And if you sort of smile and speak enough Spanish and hold, I'd always pick up Lily for these moments because she would grin and look cute, and then they'd be more likely to say, okay, where's your van? Okay, I'll sign this thing. Yeah. So that was an exhausting one. I think it was also doubly exhausting because it was a double border crossing, because it was El Salvador to Honduras to Nicaragua in one day. So it was a lot of border crossings to deal with in one day.
It sounded exhausting. It sounded intimidating, but the way you wrote it, it was absolutely comical.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I know. Yeah. In fact, I was thinking as I was telling you the story, like, oh, I'm not going to just describe the same way that I wrote it. So read it in the book for the funny details.
Yeah. You guys have to go. You have to get this book and read it. It is just awesome. So I do have chapter 17 open. I believe it's the very beginning of chapter 17. I'm going to read just a little bit because we can't not go through this. It's just too good. So in chapter 17, you had step number 1 is leave the country. As we get close to the border, I dig out our passports, van title, and cash from our safe. We eat a snack and grab our hats and sunglasses, ready to stand outside in the sun for hours. Lily brings her iPad because it's going to be some boring shit. Yes, that is a direct quote from our sweet 16-year-old daughter. Gotta remember, she overhears...
6-year-old.
6-year-old, thank you. Our 6-year-old daughter, gotta remember, she overhears everything we say. I absolutely love how you walk the reader through your experiences in such a captivating, descriptive way. Without giving too much of the book away, what else are you doing to prep for border crossings?
Just, I think, as you were reading there, just making sure we have all the right paperwork. One thing to prep for a border crossing is even happens before you leave the previous country, which is making sure you get stamped out correctly. So when you first enter a country, you get what's called a TIP, a temporary import permit. And then when you leave that country, you have to have it canceled or annulled or stamped out in some way, because otherwise when you enter the next country, they're going to be concerned that you're doing something wrong, something illegal. So you've got it. So, and some countries will take it from you. Some countries will stamp it and hand it back. So taking a picture of that, storing it somewhere, like I had a Google Drive folder where I'd store pictures of all the paperwork we had. I still have it somewhere in a folder in our house now. Because you just never know what they're going to maybe ask for. And the other thing I think maybe a tip is checking before you leave, when you enter a country, checking before you leave that all the paperwork has the correct spelling of your name and your van, the VIN number, your vehicle identification number written correctly on there. Because we did hear stories of people where the person had just typed in the wrong number, and then they got all the way across the country and tried to leave, and were told they had to drive back to the place where they had entered the country to get it corrected, which would be a nightmare. We did have 2 instances. Once where they spelt John's name wrong. Everybody in Latin America spells John, J-H-O-N. It's really interesting. But over and over and over again, we'd get our tip handed back to us, and I'd point out and say, oh, the name it's J-O-H-N. And they were like, what? J-O-H-N? Like, what is that? And they'd have to correct it and reprint it out for us because I didn't want to get into a situation at the other end of the country where we couldn't leave because the name was spelled wrong. Another time, which country was it? I can't remember now. They wrote down our nationality. It was Argentina, because they wrote down our nationality as Argentine, which I was worried was going to be a problem, because that one we didn't notice actually, because I was so used to checking the VIN number in our names, and it didn't end up being a problem when we left, but I just thought that was an odd one, an odd mistake. But yeah, just generally having all your paperwork ready at every border crossing, having your passports, and just having everything you could possibly need. I think that's kind of the key. And then just being really patient and smiling and understanding that the people there are not probably very excited to be there either, and trying to be nice to them.
Having to travel one country twice. Whew.
Yeah.
So with safety, what are your processes for being smart about safety?
Yeah, I guess, some people have asked specifically about weapons, And so I always say we did have a can of bear spray. We never took it out a single time. Because I think really the best safety precautions are like awareness and observation. So I already mentioned about following the local news. So I would always add into my news feed on my phone each morning when we had reception. I'd always check the news for a few different local newspapers in that country. And then my second source, so that would be like local news from that country in Spanish. And then my second source would be Facebook expat groups. So that would be an English version of foreigners, their interpretation of the same set of news. So those two sources I feel like helped me stay pretty well abreast of if there are dangerous areas in the country, or, you know, like if there's an election going on, or any kinds of protests, like, oh, in Ecuador, they've just taken away the fuel subsidy and everyone's protesting. Like, there's a lot of stuff you just want to know about. And even just like being aware of the president's name, that kind of detail, it's easier to fit into a country if you know what's going on around you. But then also observation, like I say. So when you're camping somewhere for the night, you know, one thing that takes a little bit of getting used to is you're just sleeping out in the public thoroughfare. Anyone can pull up, park next to you, or knock on your door, or harass you. And it's, you know, the very first night of our trip, you already read this in the first chapter, or third chapter, I think, when we were still in California. And in the middle of the night, a car drives up and parks next to us. And it was kind of, you know, unsettling because we were kind of in the middle of nowhere out by Mono Lake, and there's nobody around. And why is somebody parked next to us? And of course, it turned out it's a friendly old man looking for help. And it was a good experience, but it does take some getting used to. So in foreign countries, especially, when we would park somewhere, I would always, if I could, talk to local people around us and just say, hey, would we be bothering anybody if we parked here? Or do you think it's safe to park here? And again, I always reference my little daughter, my hijita, and that seems to break the ice, and people are just so wanting to help, especially when you have a child. But I think you've got to think about it from their perspective. You know, if a big mysterious foreign vehicle came and parked on the square in your little town, you would be wondering what the hell's going on and who are they and what are they doing there? And if they then come out and they walk up to a few people and they're smiling and chatting and they have a little daughter and she starts playing with the other kids in the square, it's just suddenly like you're kind of part of that little community. And even if there is maybe a local troublemaker, the community is probably going to tell that troublemaker to leave you alone. And so I feel like that helped a lot. And honestly, the biggest thing I think is just luck, right? You can do everything as smart as you can possibly do, and you still might have bad luck and you still might have good luck.
Ooh. Any tips on exchanging currency as you cross borders?
Yeah, I guess. So we basically used an ATM card everywhere that we went, and that we never had problems until COVID in Argentina when they stopped taking foreign cards, and that was a major problem. Different story. But otherwise, we just always used our ATM cards. So when you first cross the border, there's obviously no bank or anything, and so you can't use your ATM card. So at first, we were very staunch about we're not going to use the random guys standing at the border because they're all going to be sketchy and dishonest. And so we would try to use the currency from the previous country or US dollars or something like that. But it didn't take long before, you know, as long as you know what the exchange rate is and you just look it up on your phone before you got there, you could just ask them, what exchange rate do you give me? And if it was about right, then it worked. So we pretty quickly we started doing that, where when we first crossed the border, we would get just a little bit of money, you know, $20 or something from someone standing there. There's always plenty of people standing there. You just make sure that you're getting the right exchange rate. And then once you get to the next town, then you take out more money.
And then what about keeping all your documents safe? Did you have a process for making sure you didn't lose anything, or if you did, you had backups?
Yeah, so part of that process is before you leave, taking good photos of everything. So our passports, driver's licenses, international driver's licenses, health insurance cards, all that kind of paper, the van title, the van registration. I got good photos of all of those, digital photos, and stored them all in a folder in the cloud, basically. Also, actually, just as a side note, at that time, check all the expiration on everything, because if your passport or something expires in the middle of the trip, it's so difficult to renew it. So, for example, I think I renewed my passport early because it was going to be expiring like a year later. And then we have a safe in the van. So we put basically our passports, and I think we took like maybe 500 USD when we first crossed the border into Mexico. So we just had our passports and the original van title and registration and about $500 USD. And those were all buried in the safe, which is kind of really a pain to get to. And so we only went into there pretty much as we were crossing borders. That was it.
Okay. And then personal, like health insurance, car insurance, what are your tips for people there?
Yeah, I guess there's a range of options, right? So if you're sort of, well, so you can do like a travel insurance, health insurance, which is much gonna be much lower cost than like a full expat and living abroad for multiple years kind of a health insurance. We opted for the latter because we were going to be on the road for a long time, and being older and having a child is kind of less risk tolerant, I guess. When I was traveling younger and on my own, I just got one of these cheap kind of, I can't think of the name of them now, but like a travel insurance plan. Is it Travel Nomads or something like that? Anyway, there's a few companies that everyone uses. And they work for, if there's a real disaster kind of thing, they'll get you out. But we wanted to be able to, if we needed to, just like have a child wellness checkup or like an OB appointment for me or basic stuff like that. And so we got a more complete plan from, it's called BDAE. I can't remember what it stands for because it's German, but it's a German company that covers anyone, any nationality, pretty much anywhere except the US because the US is so expensive. And that's the tricky thing about any of these health/travel insurance policies if you're a US citizen, because they primarily want to just pay to get you back home and then have your home country take care of you. But in this country, you may have to also have a health insurance policy here. So, for example, some of the retired people we met, they would be able to have a Obamacare type health insurance plan that was effectively free because of their low income levels. But I know before Obamacare was a thing, I'm not sure how you would manage that. And then for car insurance, you have to get car insurance in most of the local countries. Each country has a different rule, but most of them insist that you get it, and you can usually get it at the border, but sometimes you can't. So you have to check on all of that stuff as you get closer. And then we started out by having like an international car insurance policy that would actually help cover our van, but we quickly got rid of that because it was so expensive and it was very unclear if they would really be covering us anyway in a different country. It's kind of a rare thing, I think, to take your vehicle out of its home country for such a long period of time. And then we did make the other question to decide for you or whoever is, are you going to keep up your US insurance or whatever your home country's insurance is? So, because if you do, it's basically a waste of money because it's not valid for anything outside of the country. But if you don't, then it's a bit harder to reinstate it when you arrive back in the US. So we just dropped ours to the lowest possible thing and we kept it going while we were out of the country.
Super good tips. And then how have you found balancing as a family? Because you guys did homeschooling, what tips would you give other people that are traveling with young children?
Yeah, I guess the main thing is the school, of course. So for us, Lily had finished kindergarten, and so we were having to homeschool for first grade. So I did a bunch of research into which there's almost too many options. There's definitely no shortage of options for homeschooling programs. There's tons and tons of information. So don't feel intimidated by, oh my gosh, I've got to come up with a curriculum. You absolutely don't. There's so many free or pay, online or printed, so every possible thing you can imagine. We met some families with older kids who could, because Lily couldn't read yet at age 6. We met some families with older kids, and their kids would do it entirely online. So they would just log in and be online for a couple of hours a day, following whatever they had to do for that grade that they were in.
Okay. Then during times of stress and conflict, as happens with families, how did you find that you navigated that with grace?
I don't know if we're just a weird family, but it didn't really happen too much. I think maybe partly when you live in a tiny space, you can get annoyed with each other. And so I think the fact that we spent most of our time outside really helped. And we generally avoided cities. We spent a lot of our time outside, whether it was, swimming in the ocean or hiking down a trail or something like that. So I think that helps a lot. If you were really, cooped up in a van 24/7 for a long time, then I'm sure you get on each other's nerves more. The ironic thing, actually, you probably haven't got to the end of the book yet, but the one time that John and I started getting like a bit bickering at each other was when we were in a large rental house in Argentina during COVID. And I think it was because, everybody in the world was stressed that year, I guess, but we were just in such a kind of uncertain place where we didn't know what our legal status was with the government. They kept changing the rules, and it was a bit scary because we didn't know what would happen if one of us were to get sick, what would happen being a foreigner there. And we couldn't go anywhere. They were extremely strict. The very first month of COVID back in March 2020, As one of the strictest countries in the world, it was one of the things where you couldn't leave the house except on the day that matched the number on your ID card, and we didn't have an ID card. So there was a lot of tension then, and kind of just being cooped up and unable to go where you wanted to go. And we worked through that by just encouraging each other to go and do the things we wanted to do. So once the country opened back up a bit more, I would go to the local rock climbing area. John actually found a luthier and started learning how to make a guitar. And I think just recognizing that we needed to, since we couldn't do this trip anymore, which was a huge disappointment, we were kind of, stuck there with the van and unable to go anywhere, finding other outlets for our, time and energy really, really helped.
You had some amazing stories of volunteer work, from a turtle sanctuary to teaching kids. Did you guys ever need to stop and work to earn money as you went?
I think it was in Ecuador where, sooner than Ecuador, we decided we really like this. We want to do it for longer. How can we make that happen? And so we got a bit more serious about a budget and finances and paying attention to what we were spending. We had both worked in Silicon Valley for the decade prior, or even longer than that. So we'd saved up enough money to be able to travel for a couple of years at that low cost kind of travel anyway, without needing to worry about it. But it became quickly apparent that we would love to do this for indefinite. This is a great way to live. So John looked into, becoming an advisor for some startups back in California. And so he started being on phone calls where he's helping other companies start up. And he would occasionally get an hourly rate to get onto these consulting calls effectively. He also sometimes got some percentage of the company. And I, at the same time, started working for a friend of mine who has a recruiting business. So she took me on purely from the goodness of her heart, not that I have any experience in that at all. And so that was a way that we were able to make enough money I think we ended up breaking even on the year just from that job alone. And then in Argentina, like I said, I was getting into writing because of the book. But I also contacted magazines, and I was able to get several articles published in a few different magazines, and that was also a way to have some income.
Then I'm sure it was different in each country that you were in, but what did you find an average monthly budget to be, and any tips for our listeners on budgeting?
Yeah, so let's see, I actually pulled up, because there was, speaking of articles I wrote for magazines, I wrote one about this very thing, so I just pulled it up. So yeah, in the last 6 months of travel before COVID stopped us in our tracks, I'm reading aloud now, we spent about $1,200 a month on daily living stuff. So that's accommodation, food, and fuel, basically. So that's like $14,000 a year. So this was the last 6 months of travel. So that was in Argentina and a little bit of Bolivia. Yeah, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So if you say about 14 grand a year, that was daily living expenses. And then I said, when you add in some of the big annual costs, so like our health insurance, like I said, we got a really good one. That was $7,000. And the car insurance, registration, visas, phone, internet, all that kind of stuff, then our annual spend got up to about $30,000 a year. So, that can be much higher if you're flying home to visit your family or doing lots of expensive tours, but it could also be much lower if you're traveling solo or you're opting for a much simpler health insurance plan. But it's probably a pretty good ballpark. When I was doing a bunch of research on the finances before we started the trip, the number that I kept coming across on many different people's blogs was $70 a day. So that seems like a good number to sort of base on.
Do you think those costs in those other countries have increased as much as costs have increased here in the U.S. over the last year?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so much of cost is driven also by what people can afford down there. I mean, it was so amazing how much cheaper things were living, for example, in Argentina than here. And to some extent, things are lower quality, and so therefore they're cheaper. But then they're lower quality because people can't afford to buy high quality ones. So kind of a cycle. But yeah, I mean, the inflation in Argentina is crazy. When we first entered the country, I think it was about 50 pesos to the dollar. And when we left, it was about 150 pesos to the dollar. We were there 15 months. So, for people that live there, it's really hard to survive. Whereas for us, the exchange rate was in our favor. So we, the same $100 at the beginning of the year was suddenly worth 3 times as much at the end of the year. So, if you can be a foreigner earning dollars and living there, then you're living like a king. But the local people who are earning in pesos, it's really difficult.
So lockdown in Argentina, that is just totally unimaginable to me. At the same time, I don't know, maybe a forced time to reflect and start some writing was a good thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But you explain it in the book, at the end of the book, and it, like at first it sounds almost like prison, and then it sounds like things kind of, you started to figure out ways to enjoy the time and go find some rock climbing and that sort of thing. But how would you put that in your own words?
Yeah, like I say in the book, there was so much uncertainty. Being like, I think everybody in the world basically was a bit scared for that first month of March to April of 2020, because we didn't really know, is this going to be like something out of a movie, and we're 99% of the world's going to be dead in next week. And over the next few weeks it became apparent, okay, this is a serious big thing, but it's not the end of the world. But so there was definitely some tense moments for those first couple of weeks. We were trying to figure out, should we try to make a mad dash back to the US? Would it be safer to stay in Argentina? It was because we were in the middle of the country, about 10 or so hours drive from Buenos Aires, and that was the only city that they were allowing flights out of. It made it even more complicated. And the country had shut down, so you couldn't drive between their provincias, which is basically like states in the US. So each state, each provincia had a different set of rules. And so to get from where we were to Buenos Aires to get on an airplane, we would have had to cross, I think it was 3, or actually more than that, because some of them didn't let you through, so you had to go around. And each state, I'll just call them states, had you have to have this specific piece of paper from a doctor, and it has to be from 2 days before. And how are you going to do that when you're crossing multiple states along the way? And then even the tickets to get on an airplane back to the US itself, themselves were almost impossible to procure. So what we were hearing from other Overlanders was that tickets would go on sale for a new flight, and within an hour they'd be sold out, and they were selling for thousands of dollars. It was kind of a pretty bewildering time, overwhelming time. And we were kind of in this, by just some sheer luck, we were in this little town in the center of Argentina, where some friends of ours who we had, funnily enough, met back in Baja, Mexico, 2 or 3 years prior, where they had moved, settled down, bought a house. And only because of them did we show up in this town at all. And it was really lucky that we were there, because we had this cute little rental house on a hill with a little pool and a beautiful view. And it just felt like such this safe bubble. There wasn't a single case of COVID until I think November that year in that little town. And so coming from this relatively safe, stable place, it felt like a crazy idea to attempt this kind of mad dash across the country to get a plane. And then you're on a plane for X number of hours. And how, what sense does that make when you're trying to avoid a contagious disease? And so in the end, we decided to stay. And like I said, the first couple of weeks, especially, like maybe even 4 weeks, were really intense because the rules were really intense. Children weren't allowed out at all, ever, for anything. So I literally didn't see a child for weeks except for my own. It was pretty crazy. You could only go out based on the last number in your ID, how that matched with the day of the week. And it was overly complicated for us because we don't even have Argentine IDs. There was a curfew, so at 3:00 a siren rang across the town, and then the police would patrol, and you couldn't be out. So it was definitely a different experience that I had never had before, and we were very grateful to have this nice little rental house. But it was also a bit scary because we didn't know what was going to happen, and we're not Argentine. We don't have the right papers. Where are your papers? We don't have any. Our visa, you get 90 days when you first enter a country. That was due to expire it was early April, so just a couple of weeks after COVID stuff started happening. And I had already been to the aduana, I don't even know what you say, the immigration office, and in the nearest big city to ask about an extension. And they said, yeah, no problem, just come back a couple of days before it's going to expire and we'll give you 90 more days. But then, of course, I couldn't do that because the whole country was shut down. So we were expired and our van was expired. So there was just all these things kind of sort of conspiring to make us feel a bit nervous. But we just sort of hunkered down in our house and enjoyed the fact that it was warm and sunny and kept reading the news like everybody across the world, I'm sure, was doing. And then by, that was March, April. By kind of June, I remember my birthday, we started being able to go for a hike and go for a bike ride and go climbing, and then things got much, much nicer.
It's just crazy. And for our listener, go buy the book again, and you will get the rest of the story. Mary, what, if anything, restored your faith in humanity as you did this trip?
I think just so many personal interactions with local people who are always so welcoming and generous to us. It just happened so many times on the trip that someone would just, smile as we went by, pat Lily on the head, give us directions, give us a suggestion of a great place to go. It was like if ever we were having if we had a difficult situation, like for example the van broke down a few times, people would always help us. Like there's this one somewhat funny situation in Colombia. I mean, it doesn't really sound funny when I say it out loud, but our battery started, like, basically was about to explode, and we were in a propane filling station of all places. It was like, you can't make this stuff up, can you?
Boy.
And so we manhandled the battery out of our van, kind of just cut a long story short here, and set it on the ground. And I mean, there's literally, like these 8-foot tall propane cylinders surrounding us, and our battery is like hissing and spraying chemicals. And the Colombian owner came over and invited us in for some coffee. I mean, I was just kind of like astounded. So one of his employees started spraying water on it, and then realized that wasn't enough, and put it in a wheelbarrow full of water and covered it up and kind of wheeled it out of sight. And the guy brought us into his house, and we met his dad, and they brought out some food and some coffee, and they talked to us about, we were obviously very shaken and apologizing, and they were like, don't worry, it's fine, tell us about your trip, tell us about you. And oh, you like my coffee? Oh, we grow it at our own personal farm just down the road. Come and I'll give you a tour. You can come and spend the night there. And it's like that kind of situation where we were in a potentially not so great position, and it turned into a really pleasant, really nice situation, happened so many times, and it was always because of a local person taking us in.
That's awesome. And what advice would you give your 10-year younger selves?
Get a van that doesn't break down. The 10 years that I worked at Google, although it was stressful and exhausting and busy and, probably took some years off my life, at the same time, it enabled us to do this to some degree, and also I feel like I really did some great things that I'm proud of while I was there. So, would I say quit sooner and do this trip sooner? Probably not, really. I think the timing was pretty good, how we, produced a child, raised her to an age where she was relatively independent, and then were able to go on the trip. So I think the timing was pretty good.
If you could put any message on every billboard in America, what would it be?
I don't know. I guess I don't know if I'd put it on a billboard, but like the overarching message that I've kind of come away with and I would like to impart to people is to treat people who are not the same as you with an open mind and try to be generous, only because it happened to us so many times. So, especially in the context of some of the politics, not to get into that, but, how foreigners are sometimes treated in different countries all over the world, not just in this one. But the experience that we had of being very obviously foreign and yet being treated always with respect and kindness, I think it kind of stuck with me. It made me think like, wow, when was the last time I invited a random stranger into my house? I've never done that. I don't think I ever would do it, but I want to be a lot more open-minded to helping foreign people that are, like maybe confused. I mean, I've definitely, since I got back from the trip, come across someone who maybe doesn't speak English that well in some kind of a situation and been so keen to jump in and help translate or help guide them around. Or I was just in a tailor the other day, and the woman couldn't speak English very well at all, and unfortunately it wasn't Spanish either, so I couldn't help. And I feel like my older self would have gotten impatient of, this is the thing that I want done to my jacket, whatever it was. And I'm here spending 20 minutes trying to, draw it and explain it to you. And like, how can you run a business in this country and not speak English? But my post-van trip self thought it was kind of really interesting to meet this lady and try to learn a bit about how she's here and figuring out an interesting, creative way to get my message across. And like, wow, that's impressive that she's got a successful business and she doesn't speak English. Like, she must be an incredible person, So, that doesn't fit on a billboard. But my general message, I think, is just to try and be more open-minded and assume the best of people.
I think it's a great perspective. Mary, anything that we've missed?
No, I don't think so.
So let's wrap it up with some fun facts about you. What's a favorite genre of music, and who between the three of you is the best singer in the group?
I love like techno, electronic dance, like that kind of music. Growing up in London, I loved going to nightclubs and just like bouncing up and down in a crowded room to the techno beats, drums, and that kind of thing. My husband, however, much prefers rock and roll. And I'd say he's got to be the best singer. He was briefly in a band even, and he loves singing and playing guitar. So he would often serenade us. He in fact wrote some songs about the van trip. In fact, I should look those up and share those too.
That's awesome.
And what's your favorite drink in the morning to get you going?
John loves coffee, and in the hot places, I would love to make some kind of a smoothie or a fresh juice. Like in Argentina, we even had a little like a juicer thing, and we'd buy these sacks of oranges, and they would just cost practically nothing for these giant sacks of oranges, and make freshly squeezed those every day. It was so delicious. But then in places like in Peru, for example, we'd buy a bag of coca leaves, and we'd just boil hot water in the morning and put some coca leaves in there, and that was my favorite morning drink there for sort of a bit of a wake up and a warm up your body because it was so cold there.
And a favorite beverage at night to wind down after a long day? I
don't think we really had. We don't drink lots of alcohol. I mean, John would have beers occasionally. He's allergic to gluten, so it was hard to find beers, but occasionally he'd find a gluten-free beer. I would hot chocolate. Lily and I would make hot chocolate. Sometimes we'd have some Baileys. Not Lily and I, just I. But yeah, I think our evening wind down was less about a drink, and it was more about like Lily on my lap on our little chair outside reading our Kindle together, watching the sunset, or like just sort of, or even if it was already dark when we're in bed, the three of us would lay in bed together and read. It was kind of for some reason, reading was a big part of that trip because Lily, she's dyslexic, we've now confirmed, and she was really struggling to read just before the trip in kindergarten. And that first year, it was all about teaching her to read and reading every night to her and having her read to us. And I have some really, really fond memories of the three of us snuggled up in our tiny bed together, reading to each other.
That is awesome. That brings, I don't think that there can be at least for us, reading with our kids when they were little, those are some of the fondest memories that at least I look back on. So doing that during a trip like that has got to be really special.
Yeah, like some of the sound effects outside, like I'm reading a story about dragons and bad guys and whatever, and there's like howling monkeys outside the window,
Oh,
or
awesome.
the ocean waves are like crashing up really close to the van. And just being in that sort of wilderness with some wilderness type sounds, whether it's animals or nature outside of your van, it really adds to it. You just feel like the three of you are in this tiny little bubble of safety with the wilderness outside and just tucked up together under the blanket or under the sheet reading. And yeah, it's definitely some of the highlights of the trip are just these little insignificant moments.
That's awesome. Mary, what's your best advice to aspiring overlanders and adventure enthusiasts that are listening right now?
I guess my sort of, parting words of wisdom, like if you have some kind of yearning, like hidden, buried inside of you to do some kind of an adventure, whether it's living in a van or moving to another country, whatever it is, to try to just do it somehow in some baby step and just to start somehow, because you can sometimes plan forever, right? And you're never going to be totally ready. I mean, we left and the van was not done, but we just left because otherwise you can work on the van to get it perfect for years. But it's probably good enough to just go. Or the other way to think about it is to do a baby step version of it where, okay, I don't even have a van, I can't afford a van, but maybe you've got an SUV where the seats can go down in the back and you can just about sleep in there. Just go and do a one night or a weekend somewhere just to get a taste for it. And you might find that like you really hate, peeing in a bucket or whatever, and this isn't for you. And now you'll know. But you might find that you love it. And if you do love it and you've had that experience for one weekend, now you're going to be so much more motivated and you're going to make it happen.
That's great. And how can people learn more about you and keep up with all of your travels? And where is the best place to go get your book?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's pretty crappy because I'm not a tech person. I put all of my effort into writing a high-quality book, not making a high-quality website. But it's just simply monkeysontheroad.com. So from there, there's there's a video tour of the van, and there's a really cool map that shows our whole route from the U.S. to Argentina. That's like you can zoom in and out and see all the places we went. And there's a lot of photos. I've organized them by country, and obviously links to buy the book and stuff like that. And then the book, just go to Amazon and type in Monkeys on the Road.
That's awesome. Any more information you'd like to give or useful resources that our listeners should check out?
Yeah, I think I maybe briefly mentioned it, but if you're going to go overlanding, the app iOverlander is extremely useful, free on your phone, Android or Apple. And the Facebook group, Pan American Travelers Association. Those are probably my two most useful things. So even if you hate Facebook, just like join that group, nothing else, just so you can partake in conversations and look up all of the really useful posts that people have put on about, like, how do I cross this border? How do I deal with buying gas in Bolivia? How do I deal, like, there's just all these obscure things that you wouldn't even know you had to think about. And that group's got tons of answers.
Thank you so much, Mary. Safe travels and adventures to you. A remote cheers to you as we look forward to our overlanding paths crossing again, hopefully in person.
Yeah, if you head south from Oregon and you come through Utah, then you have to come visit.
We might actually do that. Give our best to Lily and John. We really appreciate you taking the time. It's been awesome getting to talk with you. And again, I just can't tell you enough how much I think your book is absolutely fantastic.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad you enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, thanks, Mary.
Yeah, bye guys.
I woke up with the moon in my eyes and looked over at you. How did I get here? What did I do right? It was the day that I met you. It changed my life and now we roll on down the highway to see what's next for our lives. Where will we go? What will we learn tomorrow? I don't know, but on we ride. So many people passing by outside my window. So many waves, so many smiles. People are people wherever you go, just trying to make it through life. But on we ride now, and so we roll on down the highway to see what's next for our lives. Where will we go? What will we learn tomorrow? I don't